All right, welcome to the 9th lecture in Kent State's Games for Education course. It has a bit of a long title, Chocolate-Covered Broccoli, Finding the Fun in Transformational Games. So let's talk about this title a bit. The phrase chocolate-covered broccoli is one that's brought up a lot in transformational games and serious games and educational games. The idea is that we're taking something traditionally boring, like educational content, and trying to dress it up in something traditionally fun or entertaining, like games. This is a known bit of jargon in the game industry, especially in this sector. So it's a metaphor definitely to be familiar with, and it gets used a lot, as in this presentation by Mark Chen and some others, where he talks about how a topic that we're going to discuss today, gamification, ruined, a game that was traditionally fun. So if you want to check that out, there's a website right there. It's about how gamification destroyed some of the fun parts of World of Warcraft once like optimal strategies were found. So definitely go check that out. But we're not going to discuss that particular case here today. What we will talk about is gamification. Which, as you can tell, I'm a huge fan of. I'm being sarcastic in case you can't tell. But we're going to talk about definition, examples, and problems of gamification. And then we're going to talk about ways to get around it, including, we're going to revisit game psychology, but use that as a segue to talk about, a type of usable thing in design in general called patterns and pattern languages. So we're going to look at some pattern exercises by game designer Chris Barney and how those can be used to avoid gamification. Then lastly, we're going to look at my game La Mancha to look at how a tabletop educational game was also made with an eye on creating a retail entertainment game. So it serves two purposes, both as an entertainment game that you would buy for your game night, but also it has an educational component that has given it additional life and additional value outside of just the entertainment market. So, it can cross-promote very easily. So, when people talk about chocolate-covered broccoli in games, and transformational games, they're usually talking about gamification. So the nice definition of gamification is this: using game reward systems for non-game activities, which would mean, if you're doing something like working out and using, a workout app to guide your progress through it, usually you'll see, excuse me, I'm starting to fight off a cold here. You might be working through your workouts and then logging them in an online system, and then that might give you points or levels or badges or something. That's usually when you see gamification. Excuse me, had to cough a bit. But over the last 10 years or so, gamification has been the topic of lots of books on how to employ it in education, training, business, sales, and other applications. Where reward systems are applied to non-playful activities like buying products, doing schoolwork, using a business's website, or doing other things that a company may want you to do that is not like intuitively interesting or fun. You can recognize gamification anytime you encounter a system that offers you things like points, levels, achievements, or badges for accomplishing real-world tasks. So like in the last little cartoon, a company was talking about gamifying grout. So if you lay grout or buy grout from this company, you can get badges. So that's, lots of games have points and badges and achievements. But when you apply those sorts of thinking to things that are not game-like or that are not themselves games, that's when you get gamification. So the educational management platform Blackboard has an optional badging system that teachers can use to incentivize students to engage in a class's page. I personally don't use it because I don't like gamification. So examples of gamification include the website and app Super Better by Jane McGonigal. Players complete quests that are actually real-life wellness tasks, then log them on the site for points. The language learning app Duolingo is another example of gamification, and it's actually one that I use. I actually like Duolingo quite a bit. Players are given points for taking language lessons and awarded bonuses for using the app for multiple days or watching the in-app ads for Duolingo sponsors. Other more subtle examples include reward programs created by companies for people using their products or going to their store. Kroger, the supermarket chain Kroger, actually has a gamified app. It takes the idea of like a loyalty card to the next level by actually also having like a gamified app on its website. And then, likewise, the U.S. Army uses gamification and different types of media as recruiting tools. So everything from a gamified website to the actual game, America's Army. So as game designers see it, gamification is often badly implemented game design. And that's not my quote. It's just one that people use a lot. So the definition of gamification is point systems on non-game activities, but a lot of people call it badly implemented game design. In another slide from the Mark Chen presentation, he talks about how practitioners of gamification often forget the whole experience of why games are fun and concentrate only on what an outside observer might think about why people think games are fun. Basically, if you play games, you know that there's more to games than just them giving you rewards and them conditioning things. But to outside observers, they just see games as automations that give you lots of points. And that's, as we know, that's not really true. So the question becomes like, how do we fix this? Because as we know, applying these mechanisms carelessly is like indiscriminately pouring chocolate on different things rather than finding foods that the chocolate pair well with. Like, chocolate covered broccoli or chocolate covered onions. It can result in, at best, the boring part still being boring, or at worst, the whole thing being super icky and disgusting. So I'm, as I've said, I'm not a big fan of gamification, but as I've also said, I like apps like Duolingo. And I once, years ago when Wii Fit was a big thing, I used Wii Fit to track my exercise. So I'm being kind of hard on it, but, I should note that there are examples that genuinely help people. Jane McGonigal's gamification systems are popular and result in best-selling books because for some members of their audience, reward systems are enough to have genuine results. Remember, we talked a lot at the beginning of the semester about evaluating your audience. Sometimes gamification is good enough for an audience. As with many things in transformational games, the success of your work depends on the research you've done into your audience and into the type of platforms they'll gravitate to. But that's not to say that we should always settle on gamification. Gamification, like I said, can come across as one note, it can come across as very gimmicky, and it doesn't really show the entire experience of what a game has to offer. We can do more than just using blank gamification. So let's look at the psychology of games again and really consider what type of cognitive interaction we are having with the games that we're playing and see how we can start to utilize beyond just gamification, which is often feeds off of behavior theory, how we can use the other two methodologies, Montessori method and constructivism. So one of the main criticisms of gamification is that they boil games down to what's called a Skinner box style of interaction. if you recall, this is a really badly stretched out image. If you recall, a Skinner box is where there would be a rat in a box, and if a light blinked, and the rat pulled a lever, some food would come down the chute, and the rat could eat the food. But if the rat pulled the lever at the wrong time, they would get a shock from an electric grid. And the idea was that to see if this sort of conditioning and training would make it so that the rat knew to only pull the lever when the light came on. So one of the main criticisms of gamification is that they turn games into literally that, a box where you do a good thing for at a prompt. So you specifically see this type of gameplay in games like Farmville and or Tiny Tower, or really anything where you don't get to interact with much of the game's mechanics except in drawn out intervals. So plant some wheat, and then you have to wait like 48 actual hours before you can get the wheat. Unless you pay like actual money for special in-game currency that you can use to make the game function more like a full resource management game. So games like this are real. They're often called Skinner boxes because they condition you to either just like blandly press buttons on prompts. So like, oh, my wheat is done, I better go pick it, press button, done. Or they condition you to think like, oh, I'd better, buy this so I can get my full meal. So that's a criticism of free-to-play games, but then also gamified things. In your optional textbook, though, Resonant Games, which is available in full on the shown web address that's also in the syllabus, the authors talk about how they avoided gamification in the chapter Games Not Gamification, using some of these other methodologies. So one of their games, Lure of the Labyrinth, has elements of gamification, but through several particularly playful and interactive ideas, it avoids being a full-blown gamification program. So the authors highlight these examples specifically. The ability of players to customize their own avatars and therefore explore new identities, the way that the game scales over time and becomes more complex as players reach later levels, like traditional commercial games do, the way that the game lays the foundations for later learning in the topic rather than being self-contained, i.e., the game exists not to solve all of the educational problems and do all of the educating, but is sort of like an assistance piece that is part of a larger plan of educating with. Maybe there's a study guide and a teacher will give some lectures or lessons, and playing the game just offers part of the discussion. It gives people like a frame of reference to work from as to make the discussion more meaningful. Another game they describe is a science game for middle schoolers called Vanished. Vanished is sort of like an open role-playing storytelling game where Vanished avoids gamification in several ways, such as giving players choice of how to approach the game, designing the game to emphasize social connections between players, building science knowledge together, building a strong fictional world, so it has like a big narrative element that players could interact with, and designing in-game tasks so that they're both playful and reflective of the problem being solved. So even when we look at just these two examples, we can already see how the principles map to the different types of psychology that we studied. Yes, there are rewards because they're games, and lots of games have rewards, but there are also opportunities to interact freely with the game elements in a Montessori style. The game also features scaffolding challenges and multiple paths through the experience. Again, very Montessori style things. It lets you sort of use your senses and use your interactions as a way to absorb information about the topic rather than just, feeding you the information and then giving you rewards when you respond to like the correct questions or something like that. And then the game also uses different types of constructivist learning, such as repetition. If you recall, constructivist learning is the one that repeats in loops, and you learn by trying and failing and trying and failing and trying and failing, and each time hypothesizing about what might be the correct way to approach a problem. It's very much like the scientific method in that way. But there's also an element of constructivism called social constructivism, where learners work in groups and contribute to a shared pool of knowledge. So by, for example, like in your class, the way that I do the class that you're in right now, you're learning you're not only doing your own project, but you're also doing your own project around other groups. And when I talk to one group, other groups can hear what's going on. And, we start talking about these types of games, and soon we develop a sort of group think way of approaching this type of, transformational game design. And that's called social constructivism. Again, it's loose and making based, but it also allows people to, like, groups to exchange information and learn from one another's like how their projects are going. So, you can apply the same thing in group-based game environments. Groups can make, they can discover material together and then contribute to the entire group's understanding of the material rather than just their own studying. And in a way, these principles also map to the question of, you'll hear this a lot in games as well, intrinsic motivation or extrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation is if you're moved forward in a task by your own interest, and it's also doing an activity for the satisfaction of doing it rather than being rewarded for it. Being rewarded for it by an outside force is extrinsic motivation, which is doing a task to be rewarded through external means such as rewards or compensation. So if you ever hear anybody talk about doing what they do purely in terms of like, well, this is what I get paid for it, that's extrinsic motivation. So by emphasizing free experimentation, repetition, social knowledge building, and other things, Montessori and constructivism give players in your games more possibilities for building and expressing intrinsic motivation than operant conditioning, which operates more in extrinsic areas. So by building intrinsic motivation or the possibility of it into your games, players will be more interested and they'll have more fun. And as an aside, I also want to introduce a game studies concept called possibility space, which is the amount of things a player can do within a game. The opportunity for more free play offers more possibility of custom experiences. So there's a topic called emergence, or a concept called emergence in games. And basically it's, if you have a set of rules, what the player does with them is potentially unforeseen. So this is where, you get things online like people, exploiting the physics system of a game to create new movements. So back in the day, this was like rocket jumping in first-person shooters. So people would exploit how rocket-propelled grenades would propel the player's character into the air and learned how to use it to do super jumps. Or speedrunners using glitches to skip areas of some games. So that's all within what one would call the possibility space of a game, because if the rules allow it, it's within the possibility space. It's possible. So, it doesn't have to be all glitches, though. When you make a game that has a big possibility space, you've either A, made lots of mechanics, so lots of things to do, but that's a lot of work, or you can have mechanics in your game that offer lots of different ways to use them. So such in the case of like a character builder that has lots of parts. So, the more hats, the more potential combinations, or the more hats and mustaches and earrings and glasses and shirts and pants and dresses and, everything. The more parts you have in one mechanic or one system like that, the more open-ended your game or that part of the game will be. Same thing if you're building like a tabletop game. If you have a big open-ended storytelling system like in a role-playing game, the mechanics that you actually have to design might be fairly small. The number you might have to design is fairly small, but players can then kind of take that system and run with it and create huge possibility spaces. Like D&D, yes, those books are very thick, but if you think about any role-playing game, especially indie role-playing games where the books are much smaller, they still have huge possibility spaces because the player can come up with their own way of approaching problems based on how they choose to tell their story. It's very open-ended. So behavior theory centric games and gamification systems tend to offer very tiny possibility spaces. So more playful transformational experiences with strong customization or exploratory or social components offer bigger possibility spaces. So to avoid the chocolate-covered broccoli issue of gamification, we have the exploratory positive psychology of Montessori and constructivist learning. We have systems that build intrinsic motivation, and we have mechanics that build large possibility spaces. When we find game mechanics or other design combinations that help us solidify these areas, how do we remember them for future projects? That's where design patterns come in. The idea of patterns comes from architect Christopher Alexander, who in 1977 published a book of design where he created several hundred repeatable design ideas that could be used anywhere. These patterns were based on human psychology and how people reacted to the built environment around them. This book was one of Will Wright's inspirations for SimCity and The Sims. And it's said that I can't remember which of these games it's supposed to be, but if you use patterns from this book, your Sims characters will be happier. So there's a pattern. There's an example of a Christopher Alexander pattern, like arrange houses to form very rough but identifiable clusters, and then with common land in between and paths. So, if you look at this is something that is very general, but it's very practical, and you can easily implement it in lots of different environments. In fact, a lot of college campuses employ this in how they lay out dorms, so that you do have these welcoming common areas, but they also accomplish the task of building a small community among the people who are in those common areas. So this is not Christopher Alexander. This is a friend of mine, Chris Barney. And the idea of patterns caught on in other fields, such as computer science. And the idea of having predetermined parts that could be mixed and matched was very influential. Several efforts to make pattern language for game design have existed, but for our purposes, I'm going to look at Chris Barney's work. So Chris's look at Alexander's patterns go beyond trying to find a system of repeatable parts. That's what most of these studies are, is like, let's find these repeatable patterns. What Chris wants to do, Chris Barney, not Christopher Alexander, is look at the core of Alexander's patterns. So this quote in front of you is not Chris Barney, it's Christopher Alexander, but it's the quote that Chris Barney, who's the person in the picture, I know, all these Chris's. So this is the quote that Chris Barney was from Christopher Alexander that my friend Chris Barney was inspired by. Each pattern describes a problem which occurs over and over again in our environment, and then describes the core of the solution to that problem in such a way that you can use this solution 1,000,000 times over without ever doing it the same way twice. Again, if we look at this pattern, you can see where this applies in, here's two different orientations, one very orderly, one more scattershot, but it has commonalities of a particular number of buildings and a common area. So what Chris Barney was interested in is looking at this core kernel of Alexander's patterns and finding, what if there, instead of a system of patterns for game design, there is a system of making so game designers could make their own patterns. So he came up with this system for pattern language development for game design. And, through this, people could look at games that they've played or their own game projects and determine how to create influential patterns that they can then like kind of bottle up and use for later. So what does this mean? Like what, some of you may be wondering, okay, cool, but what really is a pattern in game design? So I'm going to use one from level design because that's like my area of expertise. So take almost any design talk at a conference, any ever, at a conference like GDC or GDEX or East Coast Game Conference or Vector Practice, whatever. Especially those where someone describes how they made a thing in their game, and it will be generally of this format. While we were making our game, we noticed that X was a problem, so we used Y solution to solve it. So that Y solution is a design pattern. Most talks at conferences are people presenting a pattern they found. We don't call it a pattern, or it's not bottled up like a pattern. But in reality, most things are a pattern. So this is a slide from Robert Yang's GDC 2018 Level Design Workshop talk on lighting environments. So like, look at this. Highlight exits and the critical path with lighting. That's a pattern. That's something that you can repeat in so many different environments, so many different games. And that really just requires, some sort of wayfinding point and a light mechanism in a game engine, usually a three-dimensional game engine. But things like spotlights act as key lights to draw attention to exits, make a hierarchy, important exits get more light, take layout into account too. That's a pattern. That is what you would call a pattern. So you could make the pattern of highlighted exits and critical paths. That's a pattern. And what that means is that's how a pattern usually shows up. So back to Chris's work, his pattern template is a guide for designers to look at their own game and determine patterns that they have seen in both their own and others' games to solve issues. Again, how do we get people to move where we want them to? We use the pattern of highlighting exits and critical paths. Bam. So how do you make your own pattern? So to use Chris Barney, not Chris Alexander, Chris Barney's system, you do these things. You answer these questions. First, you name the pattern. And you want to give it like a catchy, easy to remember, evocative name. And then you give a rating to the pattern, and I will, in the class reading, is a link to Chris's guide on how to do this. But you can, Chris has a scoring system on how to actually score the pattern to show like how confident you are that the pattern could apply to lots of games. Then you put down, then there's I'm not reading all of these. I'm going through the important ones, because sometimes you might make an image that describes the pattern or embodies the pattern. That's if you were to make a pattern language-esque book. And then sometimes you would write who made the pattern if you're working with a group. But the next is a design problem that the pattern is meant to solve. Something like players need to know where to go in a 3D game. Then you would create the pattern of highlighting exits. Then you put a description of the pattern, something like highlight exits and critical pass through levels. And then you write down a list of games that use this and how. So for example, in this game, you'd talk with this pattern of lighting exits, you'd talk about how most FPS or first-person shooter levels use lights near exits. But because we're trying to make it general, it doesn't have to just be lights. You might say BioShock Infinite uses contrasting colors. So the exit might be more warm colors like yellow or orange, whereas the rest of the room is cooler colors like blues or purples. And then alternatively, you might look at a game like Portal that uses different types of textures to denote different types of areas of the level. So lots of areas in the test chambers have the portal wall, whereas the areas around the exits might be textures that you can't put the portal wall. That doesn't apply to every room in the game Portal, but it's a good general rule. It's a general type of implementation that still allows the player to navigate and still fits into this pattern of highlight exits in some way. And then you mark the seed. Now the seed is tough because you have to be knowledgeable of game design theory to really write down the seed. But it can be helpful to say like, well, this pattern is associated with this other idea that people talk about a lot. You'll see what that looks like in a second. And then, the last thing is parent and child patterns, which mention how the pattern relates to other patterns that you might either be aware of or might have made. The last two, the parent and child patterns, are really more if you're either working on a big pattern making project or if you're pattern making with an editor. So if you were to give these to somebody like Chris, who's working on compiling this is his research, he might even, fill out something like this. So I'm going to make up a pattern to show you how this works. So I'm going to make a pattern for my game La Mancha. And, my design problem is how to increase player engagement with learning material or subject matter. So for those who don't know, La Mancha is a storytelling card game based on the book Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes. It was written in 1605 or published in 1605. And, it's a great piece of Western literature. But it's also a really big, thick book. So how do you increase player engagement with that type of material? So I have made a pattern that applies to my game called co-petitive storytelling. So my confidence in this, and again, I will provide links to the rating system where it's written up, but basically it has a confidence of 4. And what this means, it hits the points that, designed by Chris Barney of it's a common pattern. So you see it in lots of games. It's demonstrated. So it's been demonstrated in other games. It's validated, meaning that it has, in being demonstrated, it has been shown to work. And it comes from lots of different independent game designers have come across it. So it's something that exists in a lot of games, but I'm taking it and I'm putting a name on it. And that's a lot of things that you discover when you work with patterns, is that it might be something that has been intuited before, but nobody's sat down and kind of written it up. So I'm going to sit down and write it up. So my design problem, again, how do I increase player engagement with learning material? So the description, which is the solution, is I want to create a set of competitive game mechanics that encourage players to create their own narratives through interaction and or open-ended storytelling challenges. And you'll see how that applies to La Mancha specifically in a second. That multiple players are having input on the narrative action yields emergent outcomes. So what this means is that I want to make a game in which players take actions, and because those actions are contextualized in some sort of theme, then suddenly by playing the game, the players are creating storytelling. So think of any time you play, The Legend of Zelda. Your path through The Legend of Zelda is different from your friend's path in The Legend of Zelda. And if you were to sit down and write the book of you playing The Legend of Zelda, you would write it down like, Link was doing things within the story of Ocarina of Time or whatever. And that's you creating what's called an emergent story. Your gameplay, by being your unique use of, Nintendo's system that they've established in Ocarina of Time or Breath of the Wild. Let's go Breath of the Wild. It's way more emergent. It has a bigger possibility space. So let's say Breath of the Wild, by the way you address Breath of the Wild is going to create a different story than the way your friend plays Breath of the Wild. But what we're doing now is instead of having that like highly themed, highly emergent gameplay in a single player game, what if we were doing that, but in a highly themed, highly emergent storytelling context that is a competitive multiplayer game? So the game elements being manipulated, so characters, environment objects, environments, enemies, etc., should be given heavy thematic context, such as being memorable character settings or props. So games that use it. Now remember, we're doing this in 2019, so if 2021 there's like some other huge new narrative-rich multiplayer game that drops, I apologize, people in 2021. So games that use it, most RPGs, Dungeons and Dragons, and Pathfinder, etc. So that's, those aren't always explicitly, that's why it's co-competitive. At least I've maybe had dungeon masters that are always trying to one-up us, but, you're always competing with some like other entity, be it the system or be it like a dungeon master that's trying to thwart you in different ways. And all of your things have all of your actions are storytelling actions. So at the end, if you were to like write your D&D game down, you'd probably have a book. And in fact, that's how a lot of D&D books are written. They just write down games of D&D they've played. If you've ever played the card game Gloom, it's a competitive storytelling game where you're trying to just make up a bizarre and depressing history of a really dark and dreary family, but you're all trying to do it and have the darkest, dreariest family. So that's what Gloom is about. It's co-competitive. It's co in this case because even though you're all storytelling, you're actually also contributing to a larger story. So any online competitive game. So think of Overwatch. So in Overwatch, you are each a character. That character has an established identity. Those characters have established relationships with one another in the game's fiction. And even though the game's fiction doesn't play out in every online match of Overwatch, if you were to play a game of Overwatch and then put your match into the context of the narrative, and again, write it all out, you actually might have a really compelling story. The same thing happens if you play Halo. The same thing happens if you play a game like Left 4 Dead. Anytime that there is a particularly strong narrative component to even online multiplayer games, and again, I'm thinking of even recently at the time of this recording, they had the switch over from Fortnite season 1 to 2, where they like had a black hole swallow all of the first season world of Fortnite. That's a embedded narrative thing that the developers came up with, but it still has like huge storytelling ramifications on how different multiplayer players experienced it. And then of course my own game La Mancha. So anytime you have players competing, but in competing they're actually manipulating these narrative components, which then if you think about it actually produce a story, that's co-competitive storytelling. So the seed, and this is like, again, I know this because I deal with game design history and game design theory, the seed of this is emergent storytelling in games. Emergent storytelling being the story of you playing the game and what happened. Parent patterns, I don't know, again, because this is a pattern that I made solely for this class. I don't know what other parent patterns in a greater work of patterns there might be. However, my bet is that they would probably involve multiplayer games, competitive play, or games with narrative settings in some way. So I could link it to stuff like that. Child patterns, that's where the question mark is. I'd have to, unless I made some other patterns, I wouldn't really know where to go with that right now. So, again, this is how a pattern comes to be. You look at a game, you look at types of games, you look at problems that they have to solve, and then you try to package a particular type of way of thinking about your game, or like a design mindset into a repeatable activity to do in your game. So like, again, if our design problem is how to increase player engagement with either learning material or subject matter, forget the learning material part. How do we increase, you can even say player engagement in a game? And, you can look at Overwatch. People are heavily invested into the fiction of Overwatch, even though a game of Overwatch itself, like an Overwatch match, doesn't have a whole lot of fiction. But, in playing Overwatch, you are Widowmaker. I'm totally blanking on all of the Overwatch characters right now. Wow. You are Tracer. Your characters, you are Doomfist. You're all of those characters doing things that Doomfist would do in the world of Overwatch, even though like in actuality it's really just like an online multiplayer match between characters of different stats and abilities. So, but everything has this narrative context, and then you could theoretically walk away and be like, remember when Doomfist did that? Remember when Tracer did that? Wasn't that interesting? And then like, it's almost like it could then become fanfic. And that's what's really interesting about, again, narrative but competitive. But in competing, you're also working together to make an overarching story, and that's where that pattern comes from. So here's a game that is most definitely not a Blizzard-made online multiplayer game. It's my game La Mancha. So I made this pattern to describe making and playing this game. So the core playable elements of La Mancha. So the pattern, again, was made from it. It's a storytelling card game for 3 to 5 players, where each player takes on the role of a knight, similar to the literary character Don Quixote. Don Quixote is the title character of the 1605 novel that I mentioned earlier by the same name, by Spanish author Miguel de Cervantes. Don Quixote is an old man who reads too many books about knights and chivalry and decides that he wants to travel the world saving the oppressed. So the equivalent would be if you locked yourself in a room and watched all of the Marvel movies back to back with little food or water, and went crazy and pretended to be Captain America and immediately went outside and started punching mailboxes. That's like what Don Quixote did, but in 1605, when knights and chivalry were but a memory. So he's enacting his fantasies of living in this fantastical world by acting like a knight in a world that doesn't have knights anymore. And he fights things famously like windmills. So people playing La Mancha have a hand of chivalry cards, which if you look at this image are the blue cards, with quotes from books of chivalry. So it has sort of a apples to apples core here, pun not intended. They respond to story prompt cards, which are the red cards, that contain situations from the novel, and use their chivalry cards to form the basis of stories or love poems to the prompts that are on the storytelling cards. By using their cards to invent new outcomes to the situations in the novel and form story arcs for their characters, the characters progress in the game by winning treasures, and that's how your character gets stronger, as you win treasures and put them on yourself. Players learn about the novel itself by seeing the content of the novel and living within the confines of this narrative context. They get to play and shape the narrative context and invent new outcomes to situations from the story. So they have some of the mechanics of the game also express ideas from literary analysis of the novel, such as how characters in it have agency over their identities, which was really novel in 1605, or the contrast between idealism and realism. All of those are also kind of baked into situations on the cards. Is, some of the storytelling challenges directly talk about these types of these themes. So a gamified version of this game, if the goal of the game is to like learn about this novel, might be where you read the novel and then check in that you've read specific chapters, or maybe a gamified version of like Read Don Quixote would be like if you answer some quiz questions about the book, you get some points or badges or something like that. That's not really that interesting sounding. So the game lets you create outcomes, instead, and going back to our look at Montessori, our look at constructivism, our look at the types of games from, Resident Games, that they said, well, there's these rewarding bits to it, but there's also these customization bits that really get people intrinsically motivated about the material. The game lets you create outcomes that are alternate to the events of the book, but in doing so, it lets you inhabit and explore, even through verbally storytelling on the tabletop, lets you explore the novel's world through the game's system. And that in and of itself still gives you insight into the source material, because by playing the game, but then also perhaps even reading the book, if you were to do the two in concert with one another, you'd get a lot more insight. You'd almost like feel the source material in a way that you never would by doing either on its own. So to demonstrate this in a different way, Diplomacy, which is a classic strategy game, it's one of my favorite board games, accomplishes something similar, except with history, specifically the history of pre-World War I European politics. So again, it's a system that represents that time rather than being the game of that time, the narrative game of that time. So at no point do you stop the gameplay and say, okay, now we got to kill Franz Ferdinand, so that we can get this war rolling. You don't even have to make the same alliances, but the game is engineered in such a way that you feel the tension inherent in that era, and by attacking each other, making alliances, breaking alliances, stabbing each other in the back, and doing all these things that were happening, you can then have a conversation about what it was like in this specific real life version of it, where it played out in this way, as opposed to the way that you played it out in the game, where I don't know, Britain and Turkey just like went pincer action on the rest of Europe or something like that. So by interacting with these systems, even if it doesn't recreate exactly, it's not like historical reenactment. It's more like, let's live in this world for a while and role play and see what and play this role and see what happens. And really, this should occur in any good transformational game. Games allow us to interact with open-ended versions of issues where we have agency over stories and outcomes. By playing the game, we create our own version of events. We can try and then try again with a different series of inputs to see what happens. That's why games are fun, and that's why people enjoy them, and that's why they're not just chocolate-covered broccoli. A good game makes us want to play it over and over and spend some time exploring its possibility space. It's not a chore, and while it may have non-serious elements that are fun, elements that are funny, mechanics that have nothing to do with the rhetoric being enacted, except maybe to make that rhetoric kind of fun and surprising and engaging. Learning in this way allows us to more deeply internalize the meanings and messages that designers want us to see than tools that are merely interactive. That's it. Usually at this point I do the assignment slides, but at this point, they're posted on the assignment page, and to be honest, I forgot to update those for this week's to have them in the slideshow. So just make sure that if you're watching this, please go on the lesson page, and it's fairly straightforward. You kind of know by now how it works. So apologies that I didn't put them onto this slideshow, but so they'll be back next week, which I think will be the last week that we have the forum assignment, which is exciting. But other than that, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope the topic wasn't too theoretical or esoteric, but hopefully, as you think about your games, and I'm sure lots of you are coming to this point, you might be looking at your game and thinking, what are some other things that I can do to make this more game-like and really allow me to explore the material more holistically. I think that, rather than, again, gamifying it, I think that if you start to think and really put them into the context of how can I make more free exploration, how can I add teamwork and social knowledge gathering, if that fits your game model, or maybe it does, like if you're making an educational game to be played in a classroom, how does players coming together and talking about their experience in the game build, so it's like a book club, social understanding of the material. And then finally, like, can I invent some patterns that allow me to take something that really worked in level 1 and then maybe make it work in levels 3, 6, and 8. Maybe it solves the problems of those levels, and I didn't even think about it until I sat down with it. Try to make patterns for all the games you ever make, because not only do they help in your design, but as I said, most talks at conferences are, look at the pattern I found, even if they're not calling it that. So I hope that you learned a lot in this lecture. The next few weeks are this is most of the specifically transformational. This is like the end of that phase where we talk about game design theories specifically catered to transformational games. In the last 4 lectures, we're going to talk about a variety of topics, but they're sort of meta topics. Some of them will be game design lessons I think you should just know, that are almost, repeats of stuff from other classes, but I just want you to remind, basically more stuff to make your game fun. But then there's going to be also some meta lessons on game, really where these types of games go. Like, you've been making these games, now what do you do with them? Where do you submit them? Who plays them? Who buys them? Who gives you money for who gives you money to continue making them? Sort of talks. What festivals do you submit them to? Things like that. And then I also have a talk in there about ways to make an impact in games that are more activism driven, and less making a game driven. And I think that's really important to know, because it is really hard to it is really hard to make a famous game. I'll tell you that right now. It's really hard to make a famous game, but there's lots of other ways to better the game industry and make yourself known in the game industry, than just making a great game. And we'll talk about that as well. So thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this, and happy game making.